And the book, again, is called On Guard. There's a new video curriculum that comes with it. I highly recommend. In fact, I was looking at it earlier today, Bill. It's quite good, you and Bobby Conway. Now, for those of you out there that want to go a little deeper, get the book Reasonable Faith. I have them both in my hands right now. Reasonable Faith goes a little bit deeper than On Guard, but many of the same arguments are in both books, so they're excellent works. Now, Bill, let's talk a little bit about the cosmological argument, one of the arguments for the existence of God. You point out much evidence for the beginning of the universe. You point out some philosophical evidence and some scientific reasons to believe the universe had a beginning. Let's just start with the philosophical argument that the universe had a beginning. What is that?
Well, there are at least two arguments that I find persuasive for the finitude of the past, that is to say, against an infinite regress of past events without a beginning. The first of these would be based upon the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things. If the past never had a beginning, if the regress of events into the past goes back to infinity, then prior to today, there have been an infinite number of events. But I argue that the idea of an actually infinite number of things involves all sorts of metaphysical absurdities when you put them in real-life situations, and that therefore you can't really have an actually infinite number of things, and that would mean that the number of past events has to be finite, and that therefore the universe had a beginning. That's the first argument. The other argument against the infinitude of the past that I find persuasive is based upon the impossibility of getting through or traversing an infinite series of events to arrive at today. It would be like having a series of dominoes falling one at a time, and before the present domino could fall, an infinite number of prior dominoes would have to fall one at a time. And it seems to me that such a thing is just impossible, and that therefore, since the present domino has fallen, since the present moment has arrived, that implies that the number of prior events is finite, not infinite, and that therefore the universe began to exist. These two arguments have been part and parcel of the history of philosophy for millennia, really, and I've never seen a good refutation of them. I think that these are good arguments to think that the idea of an infinite past is absurd.
Now, Bill, in your debates, have you ever heard, any reasonable atheist counter to this philosophical argument, or do they just completely ignore it?
Well, I've had a lot of debates, and in a few of them, the opponents have attempted to bring up objections. So, yes, occasionally they'll come up. For example, someone might point out that any finite distance you can imagine, say the distance between one wall of your living room and the other, that distance can be divided in half, and then it can be divided in half again, and then in half again, and in half again, to infinity. So the claim is when you walk from one end of the room to the other, you cross an actually infinite number of sub-intervals, and that shows that it's possible to traverse an infinite number of events to arrive at today. That's one counter objection that might sometimes be raised.
And your counter to that would be you're confusing an actual with a abstract?
With a potential infinite. I think it's vital in these discussions to distinguish between an actual infinite and a potential infinite. An actual infinite actually has an infinite number of members in the collection, but a potential infinite is a finite collection that is always growing toward infinity as a limit. It never gets there. It never actually is infinite. The infinity in this case is merely a limit which this finite process endlessly approaches. So this kind of series is really indefinite, not infinite. And I would say that the example of dividing intervals into sub-intervals would be an example of a potential infinite. You can go on dividing forever, but that doesn't imply that the interval is actually composed of an actually infinite number.
Bill, let's move on to another argument that is a argument that I guess has arisen, say, in the past 40 or 50 years, and that is the fine-tuning of the universe. Why does that perhaps point to a designer?
Well, what scientists have discovered over the last half century or so is that the initial conditions of the Big Bang were not chaotic, but quite the opposite. They were finely tuned to an incomprehensible precision and delicacy for the existence of embodied, intelligent, interactive life. And the idea that this came together simply by chance is so improbable as to be virtually impossible. So this fine-tuning cries out for some sort of explanation. And the argument here is that the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent, interactive life is that it was designed to be that way. And therefore, there must exist an intelligent mind beyond the cosmos who has fine-tuned the universe to be life-permitting.
So, Bill, explain why this totally preempts any design argument that well, let me state this another way. I always hear atheists saying, well, look, if macroevolution is true, if Darwinism is true, there's no need for God. Why does this fine-tuning argument point out that claim that the atheists make is invalid?
The great benefit of the fine-tuning argument is that it does an end run around the whole emotionally charged issue of biological evolution and goes back to the initial conditions of the universe itself and points out that these need to be the product of an intelligent, transcendent mind. So that you could admit the whole theory of evolution and it wouldn't affect this argument at all. It just completely does an end run around it. And so any improbability that biological evolution would add to atheism just layers it on the foundation already set up by the fine-tuning. Even for the evolution of intelligent life to take place anywhere in the cosmos, there already has to be in place this exquisite fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe.
Bill, clarify something for me, if you will. I've heard it said two ways, that the fine-tuning argument is an argument that says that these constants, these quantities in the initial conditions of the universe had to be just so to allow intelligent life to arise. But I've also heard it put this way, that if any of these quantities or constants were changed, chemistry might not even exist. So it's not just an argument for for intelligent life. It's also an argument that says we might not even have anything other than hydrogen or helium if these things were different.
Yes, and I think that's important in dealing with the obvious objection that people raise. Well, if the initial conditions had been different, maybe a very different form of life, some alien sort of life might have evolved. And what folks who say that don't understand is that in the absence of fine-tuning, there wouldn't even be matter. There wouldn't even be chemistry, much less planets and stars where life forms could evolve. So we're talking here about absolute catastrophe if these constants and quantities were to have any marginally different values than they do.
So it's not just an argument to intelligent life, it's an argument also to chemistry.
Yes, I suppose so, in the sense that chemistry is a prerequisite to life, and so if you don't have chemistry in place, you're not going to have biological organisms.
Now, of course, the atheist counter to this is the multiverse. Yet you quote one of the biggest advocates of the multiverse, Alexander Vilenkin. I have his book right here, Many Worlds in One. And despite believing in the multiverse, Vilenkin also seems to indicate that even if a multiverse exists, that it needs an absolute beginning. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yes, that kind of goes back to the first argument, the cosmological argument that we were talking about. What Vilenkin shows is that the theorems that imply that our universe began to exist also apply to any imagined multiverse that might exist. So that it's not just our bubble universe within this wider universe that has to have a beginning. even this wider multiverse of worlds cannot be infinite in the past. It had to have an absolute beginning at some time in the finite past. So, however the multiverse scenario might play out with regard to the fine-tuning, and we can talk about that if you want to, it's ineffectual in dealing with the cosmological argument because it cannot restore the infinitude of the past.
Now, Bill, why... It seems to me a backhanded compliment to design for such people to even suggest a multiverse, because no one suggested a multiverse prior to the Big Bang cosmology. Am I correct?
Only philosophers, I would say, I guess. You're right. It wasn't taken seriously by scientists, and yet now this is the cutting edge of the discussion of how to explain fine-tuning today. Is it a transcendent, intelligent mind, or do you go with the multiverse where you have, in essence, many spins of the roulette wheel in order to explain why you got your improbable result? This is where the heart of the debate is today, and it is a compliment to the power of the fine-tuning argument, because otherwise sober scientists would not be taking recourse to such an extravagant metaphysical hypothesis as the multiverse unless they felt absolutely forced to.
Bill, aren't these the same people that say if you can't touch it, if you can't taste it, if you can't see it, if you can't hear it, if you can't evaluate it with your senses, you ought not believe it? Can they evaluate or get any data on the multiverse from their senses? Why do they believe this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, they're not always the same people. I mean, some scientists are much more metaphysical than others, but then you're right. There are these scientistic types who seem to think that any sort of metaphysics is illegitimate, and yet postulating a multiverse is an exercise, I think, in what Vilenkin has called metaphysical cosmology. I love that label, metaphysical cosmology. It's a kind of wedding or marriage of empirical science with philosophical speculation. And in order to float these multiverse hypotheses, you really do have to resort to a good degree of metaphysics, I think.
Well, in fact, Vilenkin has famously said that with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And Vilenkin is no theist, correct?
That's right. I think he would be agnostic. I've had conversations with him about this, and he seemed to be just an agnostic with respect to whether there is a transcendent being like God.
Now, Bill, personally, how do you keep up with the technical aspects of the cosmological argument and all of the papers that are written on this? I saw that Vilenkin just wrote another paper this past April that was laden with mathematics. Personally, how do you keep up with that?
Well, I am not working in this area currently as my current area of specialization, so I will rely upon reports from others. For example, Robin Collins is working feverishly in the area of the fine-tuning argument. And if I have a question, I can go to Robin. My colleague Jim Sinclair is a physicist who is writing a book now on the question of the finitude of the past and various cosmological models. And if I have a question about a current cosmological theory, Jim will be a resource to me, and they can help to point me then to some of these key papers, like this Vilenkin paper that you just mentioned, that has been recently published, in order to keep up with the current cosmology.
We got about 30 seconds before the break, Bill, but how have folks like Hawking and other atheists responded to Vilenkin's point that whatever exists needs an absolute beginning? Did you deal with that at all?
Frank, I lost you there. The sound went out, and I couldn't hear your question.
Oh, I'm sorry. How have atheists dealt with Vilenkin's point that regardless of whether there's a multiverse out there or not, it needs an absolute beginning? Have they dealt with this at all?
I've not seen anybody deal with it. I thought in my debate with Krauss we would have a good discussion of these points, but really he never got off first base.